Beatles! Hello! Oh! Hello! Hey! Hello! Hey! Hello! Hello, Paul! Hello, John!
Four members of the Beatles are John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. All four were born in Liverpool. John and Paul met at a church fete in Woolton, which is kind of equidistant between their two houses where they grew up. And John was introduced to Paul by a friend, and they decided to play music together.
I met John when, I think when I was about 15 or so. I had a friend, a very good friend of mine called Ivan Vaughan, who I went to school with. And he said, I've got this great mate, you know. I said, I've got this great mate, you should meet him, you know. And I said, well, you know. And he said, well, look, they're playing. This mate's got a bit of a group, what they used to call skiffle groups. He said, they're playing on Saturday at Woolton Village Fete. He said, you should come along, you know. So I said, well, great, you know, I'll come along. And I remember coming into the fete.
Up on the stage, there was a few lads around, and there was one particular guy I noticed at the front, had a sort of checked shirt, sort of blondish kind of hair, a little bit curly, sideboards, looking pretty cool. And he was playing sort of one of these guitars guaranteed not to crack, you know, not a very good one. But he was making a very good job of it, you know, and I remember being quite impressed.
He was there, and he was doing great, and he was looking great and everything, but he was singing all the wrong words. There was a song called Come Go With Me by the Dell Vikings. Yes. But because he was supposed to be a skiffle group, and plus he didn't have the record, so he just made it up. He was kind of, come go with me to the penitentiary. Hey, and he was making all this stuff. And I thought, who is this person? But then I met him a little later that day.
That was John. The thing I think impressed him most was I knew all the words.
And we met and we talked after the show, and I saw he had talent, and he was playing guitar backstage and doing 20 Flight Rock by Eddie Cochran. And I turned around to him right then on first meeting and said, do you want to join the group? And I think he said yes the next day.
Paul brought George into the fold. George and Paul were a little younger than John, so they knew each other from school.
I said, well, I've got this friend who's really good, you know. And they said, well, yeah, like what? You know, I said, well, he can play raunchy perfectly. Down, 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 down. And we all love that song. So we said, well, gotta try him out. Remember, we ended up on the top deck of a bus, empty, late night bus kind of thing, and just us there. And he said, go on, George, get your guitar out. Go on, you show him, man. I thought, yeah. And he got it out. Sure enough, note perfect, raunchy, you're in.
And the three of them initially had a drummer called Pete Best, whose mother Mona ran a local venue called the Casbah Club.
As time passed, they changed their name from the Quarrymen to the Beatles, and they had a period of time where they played in Hamburg, Germany. That is where they met Ringo Starr, who at the time, this was in 1960, I believe, was in a band called Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. And Ringo would fill in sometimes for their drummer, Pete Best.
Started to get a little bit dissatisfied with Pete. Not massively, but just a little bit of dissatisfaction started to creep in.
I seem to remember him, you know, starting to not turn up for gigs, and then we kept getting Ringo in.
Ringo kept sitting in with the band, and every time Ringo sat in with the band, it just seemed like this was it.
And this happened 3 or 4 times, and then that was the end, you know. We were just pals, and we'd have a drink after it.
The truth was, we just kind of fell in love with Ringo's drumming. Behind us was this powerhouse and this person who was like taking care of the job.
I loved the front line. I just loved John, George and Paul. But I sat in a couple of times, you know. I'd be the proper musician, you know, at 12 o'clock. Brian Epstein would knock on the front door because you're still in bed because you've been up all night, and say, well, could you come down to the cabin and play with the lads? I say, sure. Did that for a few times, and then I was with Rory, and we went away to play another holiday camp, and I got a phone call. Teddy joined the Beatles. This was Wednesday, and I said, when? And Brian Epstein said, oh, today. I said, no, I can't go today. I'm in a band here. We have to sort this out. I'll be there Saturday.
Historically, it may look like we did something nasty to Pete, and it may have been that we could have done it better. But the thing was, as history also shows, Ringo was the member of the band. It's just that he didn't enter the film until that particular scene, you know?
We played the cabin. There was a lot of fighting and shouting. Half of them hated me, half of them loved me.
There was a few people there who were shouting, Ringo never, Pete best forever. And after about half an hour, I said, oh, bugger off, or something. And stepped out of this, you know, the cavern had this, it was 3 tunnels. And we stepped out of what was the dressing room into this dark tunnel, and some guy just like butted me right in the eye. That was a bad day. And then I walked under a bus, got hit by a double-deck bus.
George fought for me.
The rest is history. As far as the Beatles management, they had a number of managers in Liverpool. Alan Williams was one of them, most famously was their first manager. But the person who really changed their lives was Brian Epstein, who ran a local music store called NEMS, which stood for North End Music Store. Stocked records, stocked the local music newspaper called Mercy Beat. And he discovered the Beatles when they played at the Cavern Club, which is literally just around the corner of the street from NEMS. He took the boys under his wing, revolutionized their imagery, and really kind of brought them to the world as we know the Beatles. We can thank Brian for that.
They got a record contract pretty early on.
They stepped into the studio in, I believe, 1962 to begin recording. Their first single was Love Me Do, and their producer was George Martin. Paul actually plays Love Me Do at his concerts nowadays as a tribute to George Martin, who has since passed away.
They had a couple of singles. They did well. They kept recording. They recorded their first album in a single day, where John was very sick also, and that was just early recording times. They got a day to make a whole album. Didn't matter if they were sick or not. But that album ended up being huge, and they kind of went on from there. Now, they were pretty big in Britain at this time, and this is around the time that the word Beatlemania was coined. It was kind of seen as a crazy thing at the time, with many of the more serious music writers and journalists kind of thumbing their noses up at this, passing fad. But one thing that they had to do, which most British bands at the time didn't do, was conquer America.
They arrived in America for the first time in February 1964.
And of course, it became the biggest sensation still in the world.
And they had a huge crowd waiting for them already. Beatlemania really took off.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Well, she was just 17,
The Fab Four conquered America and changed popular culture forever.
He's ready?
if the mic's on.
Yes, he is. Singing a song. 1, 2, 3, 4.
So their popularity was already high. They played on the Ed Sullivan Show. They say that the crime rates dropped during that broadcast because of how many people were watching.
The hottest musical group in Great Britain today is the Beatles. That's not a collection of insects, but a quartet of young men with pudding bowl haircuts.
I enjoyed the sun in Miami.
Beatles have just arrived and are about to set foot for the first time in our country.
Beatlemania was huge. Everybody, every teenager was obsessed with the Beatles, screaming, crying.
They were touring for a couple of years. They had these huge concerts. They played Shea Stadium, which was to a record-breaking number of people.
They made movies, there were toys, they had an album out almost every 6 months. They started touring. Their touring schedule from about 64 to 66 was unrelentless. They toured the whole world.
Ringo, George, John.
I love it. He thinks I love the Beatles for them, and I'll always love them.
It was a phenomenon.
Are the biggest band of all time.
How long do you think Beatlemania will last?
As long as you all keep coming.
Depending on what you believe and what you kind of attribute to history, sometimes it's said that the Beatles became successful because they made their debut in America in February of '64, which was just after the assassination of JFK. And some people say that, Americans were looking for something joyful to sort of detract from the tragedy, obviously, of the assassination. Otherwise, really, it's like they had sort of the magic formula. They were 4 really charismatic young guys who were very talented. They had a unique sound that wasn't like anything else. They had a presentation that was really polished.
People demand that you think, how long are you going to last? Well, you can't say, You can be big-headed and say, yeah, we're going to last 10 years. But as soon as you've said that, you think, we're lucky if we last 3 months,
Well, obviously we can't keep playing the same sort of music until we're about 40, because when we're sort of old men, we've thought about it, and probably the thing that John and I will do will be write songs as we have been doing as a sort of sideline now. We'll probably develop that a bit more, we hope. Who knows, at 40 we may not know how to write songs anymore.
I hope to have enough money to go into a business of my own by the time we do flop.
I've always fancied having a lady's hairdresser salon, a string of them, in fact, and trot round in my stripes and my tails, like a cup of tea, madam.
They're also really funny. They were just really friendly and cheeky.
For the name Beatles, and what does it really mean?
John thought of the name Beatles, and he'll tell you about it now. It means Beatles, doesn't it? That's just a name, like shoe.
Shoe. The shoes. You see, we could have been called the shoes for all you know.
Sure, hang on to that.
Okay.
You're going to look at it now?
Yeah.
Well, good evening, viewers, and welcome to an interview with John McGregor.
That's not a
Thanks,
picture,
John.
is it?
It is. News of the Beatles.
See, you buy cheap papers.
There you are.
You get cheap stories.
Obviously, they were very cute for the young ladies. They really just were a package deal. I think that created the perfect storm for them to really be a sensation.
What kind of girls do you prefer?
My wife.
Your wife. What kind of girl is she?
She's a nice girl.
A nice girl.
Is this to me?
Ringo, when you marry, what kind of girl are you gonna?
Oh, I don't know. I haven't sorted one out yet. I like them all.
Wait, what's yeah, how about that? How about that, eh?
Ain't that really
Thank you. What kind of girl do you like? John's wife.
John's wife? Totally not.
That's a clown.
Nobody likes a smart aleck.
No, do y'all have any books coming out now, anytime soon?
John's the only one. John's the one with the book.
I haven't got one. I've got one coming out next year, I suppose, when I've written it.
Well, what's the name of it?
I don't know. I haven't written it yet.
Last night you had a lot of difficulty getting into the cabana. Did any of you get hurt at all?
Joe's got kicked
I got
off.
punched in my face a few times, but I mean that's part of life, isn't it?
We're rolling now.
All right.
We're going to put the stage on down to New Orleans.
They're famous for everything about them. Ringo's drumming is fantastic because he was a left-handed drummer that did right-handed stuff, so he's so creative. George Harrison, his And guitar licks are so catchy and unforgettable. And the lyrics that they all wrote, not only just John and Paul, like the rest of them, they all wrote fantastic lyrics that are things that you can never forget, really. And it's just their harmonies. Their harmonies, for me, personally, is the best part about the Beatles. Their voices blend together in ways that no one can ever replicate. They just work so well together.
I think the Beatles became so successful because they were really something new. Paul McCartney did this interview with Stephen Colbert, and he was talking about how the Beatles were like an amalgamation, so to speak, of all these different artists that people had already liked. All these things combined, it created this brand new sound that people fell in love with. And I think they were so influential in so many areas, not only music, but fashion and film and pop culture. And obviously, you know, towards other musicians as well, they were a huge influence. So I think that is why they became so successful, and that kind of new sound that they have is what makes them special in their own way. And they are all, you know, so multifaceted, and they have so many different genres within their music, and there's constantly so much more to explore, and pretty much everyone can find something that they like from their discography, I feel.
It's one of those things that's hard to quantify. So I think part of it was just this magical energy that's really hard to name. And what impact do they have on music and society? I mean, they had so much. I mean, just musically, they came up with so many techniques, so many new musical styles that everybody else rushed to catch up with.
Ready, fellas? Let's go. We're late.
The Beatles were living in a post-World War II environment where much of Liverpool was destroyed after the Blitz. But the Beatles themselves managed to avoid the worst of it, being very young when the war ended. But the ravages of that time were all around them in blown-out buildings and swaths of unemployed workers. Of the Beatles themselves, I think George probably had the happiest childhood.
George Harrison from Liverpool grew up in Arnold Grove. He lived with his mother, father, brothers, and sister, Louise. Louise is much older than him, so she moved away actually to America.
He was the youngest son of Harry and Elise Harrison, and George came from a very loving, intact family who totally let him indulge his passion for music, and were known to be pretty happy people.
Ringo Starr grew up very impoverished in a section of Liverpool called the Dingle. He lived with his mother, Elsie. His father was not in the picture. Elsie did marry Ringo's stepfather. His name was Harry Graves. Ringo speaks very highly of Harry. They had a great relationship.
Ringo was loved immensely by his mother and his stepfather, but he had a very hard childhood, mostly because the family was very poor and Ringo was very sickly. He was in and out of hospitals for a large part of his childhood, which caused him to miss out on most of his education. Those hospital stays did give him the chance to learn the drums, though.
Kind of made him more attuned to his creative endeavors. But overall, his relationship with his mother was very strong throughout her life. John grew up with his Aunt Mimi and Uncle George.
John, of course, had the most tragic early life. His parents, Julia Stanley and Alfred Lennon, were both unstable in different ways, Julia being something of a party girl, and Alfred being a sailor and rarely home. Seeing the potential impact on John, Julia's older sister Mimi and her husband George took over his early care, but refused to let him see his mother for years. Though he had a good life in their very well-to-do neighborhood, reading great books and listening to the music he loved through the radio Uncle George set up in his bedroom, though his tendency towards troublemaking got him in a lot of hot water at school. When John became a teen, he rekindled a relationship with his mother Julia, and the two became more like siblings than mother and son. Julia had a vibrant spirit and a huge love of music that she shared with John. She was even the first to teach him guitar, or at least some banjo chords that got him started. John had a fairly happy earlier childhood, but then his life was marred by tragedy.
At an early age, Uncle George sadly died. In his teen years, he lost his mother.
His mother was hit by a car walking home from Mimi's house. The pain of his mother's death wrecked him emotionally, and he never quite recovered.
Certainly had his share of loss as a child, which was very, very hard for him.
John, he was beautiful, very beautiful. He was a very complex guy because he had a lot of tragedy in his life. You know, his dad left home when he was 3, and he didn't see him until he got famous. He went to live with his auntie and uncle. The uncle died. I remember John telling me he started to think he was a jinx on the male side, you know. And then his mum, John's mum, lived with another guy who we used to go and visit because he doted on his mum. But then she got run over by an off-duty policeman, I think, one night and got killed in front of Aunt Mimi's house. And then his first marriage, you know, ended in divorce. So he had a lot of tough breaks, really, John. So I think he was very guarded. Having said that, you know, that was one side of him. He was a very lovable guy, very warm-hearted and great friend, you know.
Paul McCartney grew up not very far away from John in a Liverpool suburb called Woolton. He lived with his father Jim, his mother Mary, and his brother Michael. His mother Mary was a nurse.
Which gave the McCartneys great housing and earnings from the NHS. Paul's world became much darker, though, when he was 14 and his mother died of breast cancer. His father Jim continued to create a loving home for Paul and his brother Mike. And despite this loss, Paul grew up to be quite confident and well-adjusted, though of course he never forgot this first loss.
Certainly that was what gave me a big bond with John. He lost his in a particularly terrible accident, and he was very close to his mum as I was to mine. We were 2 Liverpool kids growing up who'd lost their mums at an early age.
And that really brought them closer together when they met.
We had the emotional side to deal with, and just the physical side of how we were going to earn some money, because both my parents worked. So yeah, it was very difficult.
I feel like their main message, for me at least, is the idea of personal authenticity. They broke so many barriers, and they wanted to do things their way, and they wanted to do things that were never done before, and they wanted to do it as themselves. There's one story where George Martin in the early days wanted them to do that song, How Do You Do It, as their single. They didn't like it. They wanted to do a song that they wrote, but that was not really done in those days. Artists did not write their own songs, and artists did not dictate what was on the album or how the album would come out. And they fought for it, and they ended up showing them that their songs were going to be better than the ones that were picked for them. And from there on, they just kept going and experimenting and being their authentic selves. I mean, there's also, you know, peace and love and joy. So the Beatles did not have the same feeling about prejudice that we did and we do here in the United States. And so they never really thought much about civil rights before they came to America. But when they came, they refused to play at a segregated concert. It was at the Gator Bowl in Jacksonville, Florida. They were told that the concert was going to be segregated, blacks and whites, and they said absolutely not. They would not do that. And there was a lot of pushback because in the Deep South, that was not done. Audiences were still very segregated, but they refused. And they ended up writing it into their contract to show support for the U.S. civil rights movement by having contracts that refuse to play in front of segregated audiences, which is amazing. John Lennon once said, "We never play to segregated audiences, and we aren't going to start now. I'd sooner lose our appearance money." So they really cared about this issue.
I think it'd be a bit silly to segregate people because, you know, I mean, I don't think coloured people are any different. You know, they're just the same as anyone else. But, you know, over here, there are some people who think that they're sort of animals or something, but I just think it's stupid, you know. You can't treat other human beings like animals. And so, you know, I mean, I wouldn't mind them sitting next to me. Great, you know, because it's the way we all feel, and a lot of people in England feel that way, you know, because there's never any segregation in concerts in England, and in fact, if there was, we probably wouldn't play them, you know.
You can see it between And the difference between the Beatles and the audience that they were going to play for. The Beatles did not come from a line of thought where black people and white people were so far apart. In fact, they idolized black artists like Little Richard, like Barry, and they could not believe that people would, treat other people like this just because of the color of their skin.
Really just always think of ourselves as just happy little songwriters, just little rockers, just playing in a rock group. But it gets more important than that after you've been over to America and you've sort of got knighted. We were touring, and when it was at a sort of peak of hysteria, instead of just thinking, oh, that's nice, we could have just thought, aha, click. Let's use this and for evil, But there's no desire in any of our heads to sort of take over the world, That was Hitler. That's what he wanted to do. There is, however, a desire to get power in order to use it for good. If you've got power, you've got to use it for the good.
Their touring schedule from about 64 to 66 was unrelentless. They toured the whole world. The Beatlemania was really intense for them. It took about 1965, when John had unfortunately crossed thorns with America because he'd done an interview in London with the journalist Maureen Cleave, and he had noted that he feels like the Beatles were bigger than Jesus. And he didn't realize what the Christian South in America, he didn't realize that was a problem to say something like that, but the Christian South in America did not like that.
But he said, oh, I don't know what's wrong with the church at the moment. The Beatles are bigger than Jesus Christ, like they're not building Jesus enough. They ought to do more, like gospel and all this stuff. And well, that was taken out of context over in America.
If it had said television is more popular than Jesus, I might have got away with it. But as I just happened to be talking to a friend, I used the word Beatles as a remote thing, not as what I think, as Beatles as though those other Beatles like other people see us. I just said they are having more influence on kids and things than anything else, including Jesus. But I said it in that way, which is the wrong way. Yap.
Well, some teenagers have said, have repeated your statements that the Beatles, I like the Beatles more than Jesus Christ. What do you think about that?
Well, originally I was pointing out that fact in reference to England, that we meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time. I wasn't knocking it or putting it down. I was just saying it as a fact, and it is true, especially more for England than here. But I'm not saying that we're better or greater or comparing us with Jesus Christ as a person or God as a thing or whatever it is. I just said what I said and it was wrong or was taken wrong, and now it's all this.
They started getting very hostile. They had burned the Beatles records, parties, bonfires. They, were aggressive. They were scary. I mean, the end of their touring was marred by people storming them, and not in the Beatlemania way, in the scary, hatred-filled way. So their last summer touring was very fraught with just tension, and they had rain, they had just bad conditions, they felt like they were being shuffled around and they never saw the real world. And in 1966 they decided they were going to call it quits with the touring.
They sort of began to get fed up with the fact that they couldn't hear themselves during performances because of all the screaming.
If we all wave and somebody always says, stop that waving, you're inciting them.
And they were eager to kind of step away from the Beatlemania side of things. So they stopped touring.
It was getting very hard to maintain this lifestyle. And also because they had moved so far.
This is like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which still to this day is one of the most influential and iconic albums of all time.
This period of experimentation is when things started getting a little rough, though. I think part of it was that they started really experimenting with different drugs and different lifestyle, and they just, they weren't present, I don't think, in the same way. But But that coincided with something much more tragic, was that their manager, Brian Epstein, died of a drug overdose right around the premiere of Sgt. Pepper. And that was really tough for them. They were not really businessmen, as much as especially Paul McCartney felt that he was. They really got kind of lost without Brian. And Paul decided to do the Magical Mystery Tour project, which didn't work out so great, and doing drugs and getting with their partners, especially for John and Paul, they kind of started pulling away from each other. At the end, of course, they filmed Let It Be, where you can see a lot of the strife. There was not only personal differences, but they were starting to sue each other, and there was issues between John and Paul, because Paul wanted his new wife Linda's, I think, uncle to be their lawyer, and John wanted to bring in Alan Klein, who had kind of a reputation, and Paul was not interested in that, so they ended up having a lot of animosity towards each other, which you can see in the Let It Be film.
I decided to not go with this guy, this manager guy, New York guy, Alan Klein, and I thought he was robbing us. And the others didn't. They were very enamored of him. So I had to kind of do all sorts of horrible things, like sue them. Was the most fun thing. Because I said to my lawyers, I said, can we sue this Alan Klein bloke? They said, no, he's not a party to any of the agreements. I said, he said, if you want to sue, you've got to sue the guys. So it was quite painful. I mean, just trying to save everything we'd ever made to that date. Imagine yourself, everything you've ever earned in broadcasting is in a bank somewhere, and someone's about to take it. Well, you've got to fight pretty hard.
We kind of had a war in the newspapers, and it was very upsetting, it was terrible. But the great thing about it was that after all that warring, we did make it up.
At the very end, they got together, and they decided to do one last wonderful album, which is Abbey Road.
Which is another one of the most iconic and influential albums of all time.
And even though Let It Be came out a little bit later, Abbey Road was the final, and it's a wonderful masterpiece. Just everything that we love about the Beatles, experimentation and rock and roll and harmony and guitar work and drums. It's just everything in one shot. In 1970, they officially broke up.
But they were able to create definitely some more masterpieces before their breakup.
I think Let It Be just their best way to send off their career and to finish. I think that's why they probably released it after Abbey Road, because they were like, this is our final saying to the world, and I think it was beautiful.
So they broke up, and they ended up kind of going their separate ways.
Was it hard for you?
Yeah, very difficult, yeah.
Why was it?
Because they were sort of my best mates in the world, kind of. They're four of us against the world. And then suddenly, it wasn't like that.
Other than one play time together in 1974, they never played together again.
They went on to have wildly successful solo careers, and I think each of their solo careers is something very special to explore in itself. In 1980, John Lennon was killed.
He was shot by a deranged van, and he died that night.
In 2001, George Harrison passed away from cancer. Legacy and their spirit is still very much alive among, all the fans all over the world, keeping their music alive, keeping the Beatles alive.
Even now, the Beatles style, it hasn't gone out of style. People still love the Beatles. People still play like the Beatles. People still, want to be like the Beatles, which is incredible. In society, there is no day when you walk outside in the world and you don't see some reference to the Beatles. They're so ingrained in society. They're probably the thing in the world that the most people in the world know about. And, I don't think that that's ever going to go away, whether it's, 50 years since the Beatles, 100 years since the Beatles. This is a lasting impact on both music and society that's never going to die.
So, to everybody, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, and Dankeschön, vielen Dank, und Wiedersehen, yes.
There's a quote by George Harrison who says, "The Beatles will exist without us," and I think that is very true. I think their legacy is very much continuing. Started this entire musical revolution.
Their story was just kismet. It couldn't have been, if you wrote that story in a fiction book, the editor would say it wasn't believable enough. It's crazy.
Truly a phenomenon.
People still love the Beatles. People still play like the Beatles. People still, want to be like the Beatles, almost 60 years on, which is incredible.
Each individual member of the Beatles is so interesting in their own way.
Hey Jude, don't make it bad. Take